Welcome, and thank you for being here with me tonight. Whatever kind of day you have had, whatever is waiting for you tomorrow, none of it needs your attention right now. Right now, there is only this quiet voice, and the slow rhythm of your own breathing, and the comfortable weight of wherever you are resting. You can let your body grow a little heavier. You can let your shoulders settle. You can let your eyes close, or let them grow soft and still, and simply listen. Tonight, we are going to spend some time in medieval Europe. Not in the courts of kings, or the chambers of bishops, or the great stone cathedrals that still stand in the cities of Europe today. We are going to spend our time somewhere much quieter than any of that. In the small villages and the modest houses of ordinary people. The people who made up the vast majority of medieval life, whose names were never written down, whose days passed in a steady, unhurried rhythm of work and rest, and the simple business of keeping themselves and their families alive and reasonably well. This is a slow journey. There is nothing urgent here, and nothing that will surprise you. We are going to move through this world at the pace of the world itself, which was a very slow pace, a pace determined by the seasons and the sun and the steady demands of agricultural life. And as we move through it, you can let the details of it settle over you gently, like something soft and warm, like the feeling of a room that is exactly the right temperature, like the particular quietness of very late evening when everything is still. And if somewhere along the way your thoughts begin to loosen, and your breathing grows slower, and the words begin to sound less like words, and more like a steady, gentle sound, that is exactly right. That is exactly where we are trying to go tonight. So let yourself settle just a little more, let your body be heavy, and let us begin. Imagine a small village in medieval Europe. It could be in England or in France, or in the low-lying lands of what is now Germany or the Netherlands. The specific country does not matter very much, because small villages across most of Northern and Western Europe in the medieval period shared the same fundamental character, the same basic structures, the same rhythms of daily life. The year is somewhere in the middle of the medieval period, perhaps around 1200 or 1250. The world is not yet whatever it will become. It is simply what it is right now, in this moment, in this small place. The village is not large. Perhaps 30 families live here, perhaps 40. That is perhaps 150 people, perhaps 200. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone has known everyone for their entire lives, because people in the medieval world did not move very much. The same families have lived in this same village for several generations, farming the same fields, drawing water from the same well, burying their dead in the same churchyard. The village is, in the deepest sense, a community of people who are bound together by proximity and necessity and the long, slow accumulation of shared history. The houses of this village are arranged without much formal planning. They sit in a loose cluster around the central space where the well is located and where the church stands. The stone church that is almost certainly the oldest and most permanent structure in the village, the building that will still be standing long after every other structure has been replaced several times over. The houses themselves are positioned as much by practical considerations as by any sense of order. This house faces south to catch the sun. That one sits close to the common land where the animals graze. Another is near the stream that runs along the northern edge of the village. These houses are small, very small by the standards of any dwelling you are familiar with in your own life. A typical peasant house in medieval Europe might be perhaps 8 meters long and 4 or 5 meters wide. A single room, in most cases, or at most 2. The walls are built from whatever material is locally available and locally workable. In parts of England and France, this means timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks, and a plaster made from mud and straw, and sometimes animal dung, all pressed together and smoothed to create a surface that is reasonably weatherproof when dry and maintained. In other regions, the walls might be of stone, dry laid or mortared, depending on the skill available and the tradition of the area. In some parts of northern Europe, turf walls are common, blocks of dense grassland sod stacked carefully to create walls that are thick and heavy and surprisingly good at keeping out the cold. The roof is almost always thatched, a thick layer of straw or reeds laid over a timber frame, overlapping from the ridge down to the eaves, each layer held in place partly by its weight and partly by the layers above and below it. A well-made thatched roof is genuinely waterproof and provides good insulation against both cold and heat, but it requires regular maintenance. The straw deteriorates over years of exposure to weather and must be replenished and repaired. In a working village, you would always see some roofs in good condition and some that were beginning to show their age, thin in places, settling unevenly, in need of attention that had not yet been given. Inside the house, the floor is earth, just the ground. The earth floor is packed hard by years of use, and in many houses it is covered with rushes or straw that is changed periodically, providing a thin layer of insulation between the cold ground and the bare feet or thin shoes of the people who live here. The rushes accumulate things over time: scraps of food, debris from the fire, the occasional small animal that moves through the house on its own business. When the smell of the old rushes becomes too insistent, they are swept out and fresh ones put down. This is not done every day, perhaps every few weeks, perhaps less often in winter when fresh rushes are harder to come by. The ceiling is low. In a house with a pitched thatched roof, the ridge of the roof might be 3 or 4 meters above the floor at the highest point, but the usable headroom along the sides of the room is much less, and in many houses, a tall person would need to be careful near the walls. The low ceiling is part of what makes the house somewhat easier to heat. A small fire can warm a low-ceilinged room more effectively than it could warm a larger space. The house is designed, in every dimension, to conserve whatever warmth can be generated inside it. The hearth is in the center of the room, a simple fire pit or a slightly raised platform of packed clay where a fire burns for most of the day and through most of the nights of winter. Above the hearth, a hole in the roof, or sometimes a simple clay chimney, allows some of the smoke to escape. Some of the smoke, not all of it. The interior of a medieval peasant house always has some smoke in it, a slight haziness in the air near the ceiling, a smell of wood smoke that permeates every surface, every piece of cloth, every person who spends their days inside. The smoke is not comfortable in the modern sense, but it is so consistently present that it becomes simply the background condition of interior life, noticed only by someone newly arrived from outside. The windows are small openings in the walls, covered with wooden shutters that can be opened to let in light and closed against the cold and rain. There is no glass. Glass in this period is expensive, the kind of expensive that places it entirely beyond the reach of any ordinary peasant household. The shuttered windows, when open, let in grey northern light that falls in soft rectangles on the earthen floor. When they are closed, which they often are in the cold months, the interior light comes entirely from the fire and from whatever candles or rushlights the household can afford to burn. This is not much light, not enough to read by, if reading were a skill that anyone in this house possessed. Enough to see what you are doing, more or less, if you sit near the fire or near a lit rushlight. You can imagine sitting in this room on a grey autumn afternoon, the shutters closed against the damp wind outside, the fire burning in the center of the room, the orange light of it reaching to the walls but not quite filling the corners, the smell of wood smoke and the faint smell of the rushes underfoot, and the smell of whatever is cooking in the iron pot hanging over the fire, the sounds of the fire itself, the soft crackle of the wood, the occasional small collapse of a burning piece settling into the coals, the sound of the wind outside, muffled by the thick walls. This is the interior world of medieval life, small and dim and smelling of smoke and warm in its own way, in the way that a small enclosed space with a fire in it can be warm, not evenly or reliably, but centrally, with warmth that radiates outward from the hearth and diminishes toward the walls and the floor, so that you are always slightly aware of which direction the fire is in. The morning in this world begins early, not by choice exactly, but by necessity, and by the habits that necessity creates over time. There is no artificial light to extend the working day beyond the natural light available, and so the rhythm of sleeping and waking follows the rhythm of the sun more closely than anything in modern life. In summer, this means early rising and late sleeping, long days filled with the maximum possible work. In winter, it means rising into darkness and spending long hours in the close, fire-lit interior. The first act of the morning is always the fire. Someone in the household, often the first person to wake, goes to the hearth and checks the coals that were banked overnight. In a well-tended fire, the overnight coals retain enough heat to make rekindling straightforward, a matter of exposing the coals to air and adding dry kindling and small pieces of wood. If the fire has gone entirely cold, which happens, then a fire-striking kit is needed. The flint and steel and tinder that produce the sparks that catch in the tinder and can be blown into a flame. This process is more effortful and less reliable than the simple revival of overnight embers, and it is why fire tending through the night, keeping the coals covered and alive until morning, is a practiced and valued skill. Once the fire is going, the room begins to warm. Gradually, the cold that has settled into the room overnight does not retreat quickly. The walls have absorbed the cold and are giving it back into the air, and it takes time for the warmth of the fire to overcome this and establish itself. During this warming time, the household goes about the first tasks of the morning in the cold, pulling on their clothing over the garments they slept in, moving to the fire to warm their hands, doing the essential outdoor tasks quickly, and returning to the growing warmth inside. Dressing in the medieval world is a simpler process than dressing in the modern one, partly because there are fewer garments and partly because the garments themselves are simpler in construction. The basic outfit for a peasant man or woman is a linen undergown or shirt, worn close to the skin, and over that a wool tunic or gown that reaches to the knees or the ankles. Over that, in cold weather, a wool cloak or a heavier outer garment. On the feet, simple leather shoes or wooden clogs. The clothing is not laundered frequently, perhaps a few times a year, when the weather permits the substantial labor of heating enough water and scrubbing the fabric clean. In between washings, it is worn continuously, day and night, accumulating the smells and stains of daily life in a way that would be entirely unremarkable to anyone of the period and entirely noticeable to anyone arriving from outside it. The morning meal is simple and filling and always more or less the same. Pottage is the word that is used for the thick grain-based porridge or stew that is the foundation of the medieval peasant diet. Pottage is made by cooking grain, usually oats or barley or a combination, in water over the fire until it becomes thick and soft. Into this base, whatever else is available is added. Dried peas or beans are common additions, providing protein. Vegetables from the kitchen garden, cabbages and turnips and onions and leeks go in when they are available. Herbs for flavor, salt, which is precious and used carefully. Occasionally, a small amount of fat or a piece of salted meat for richness. The pottage is cooked in the same iron pot, over the same fire, in roughly the same way every morning. The variations are subtle and seasonal. The fundamentals do not change. You can imagine the taste of it, thick and slightly rough from the coarseness of the grain, warm all the way down, filling in a way that is more functional than pleasurable. The bowl heavy in both hands, the wooden spoon scraping the bottom in the familiar way. Eating near the fire, the warmth of the bowl matching the warmth of the flames. After the morning meal, the household disperses to its work. Work in a medieval farming community is organized around the rhythm of the agricultural year, and every season brings its particular demands. But across all seasons, there are daily tasks that do not change, that must be done regardless of what else is happening. Animals must be tended, the fire must be maintained, water must be fetched, food must be prepared. These tasks are the skeleton of the day, the structure around which everything else is arranged. The animals come first, in the morning, because they cannot wait. A peasant household typically kept some combination of cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, and perhaps a horse or an ox for heavy work. The specific animals depend on the wealth and resources of the household and the practices of the region. But almost every household has some animals, because animals are central to the medieval farm economy. They provide milk and cheese and eggs. They provide meat when they are slaughtered. They provide labor in the fields. They provide fertilizer for the soil. And they represent stored wealth, a form of savings that can be drawn upon in difficult times by selling or slaughtering. Tending the animals in the morning means checking that they are well, feeding them whatever is appropriate for the season and the available supplies, and for the cattle and oxen, providing water, which may mean carrying it from the well or the stream in heavy wooden buckets. In the winter, when the animals are kept indoors or in the farmyard rather than grazing on the common land, they require more attention than in the summer, more feeding, more cleaning of the spaces they occupy. The smell of the animals and their waste is a constant presence in a medieval farming household, because the animals live so close to the human inhabitants. It is simply part of the texture of daily life. The well is the center of the village's practical life in a way that is hard to fully appreciate from the distance of modern plumbing. Every drop of water used in the village for drinking, cooking, washing, and watering animals comes from the well. This means that the well is visited multiple times a day by every household in the village, and the paths leading to it are always worn smooth and familiar. Fetching water is a daily task that falls primarily to women and older children, and it involves carrying heavy buckets or clay pots back and forth between the well and the house. Over the course of a day, a household might require many trips to the well. Over the course of a life, a medieval woman who carried water daily would carry an extraordinary weight. The well itself is a stone-lined shaft sunk into the ground to reach the water table, with a wooden structure above it supporting the rope and the bucket used to lower it down and raise it up. The water is cold, coming from underground, where the temperature is constant, regardless of the season above. In winter, the coldness of the water is simply part of the experience. You draw the water and carry it back and put it in the pot or the barrel, and that is what water is. In summer, the coldness of the well water is something closer to a small pleasure, a respite from the warmth of the working day. Let us follow the day forward into the middle of the morning, when the initial tasks are done and the main work of the day begins. For most people in a medieval farming community, the main work is in the fields. The fields that surround the village are the source of most of the food that the village consumes, and keeping them productive requires constant attention and labor through the growing season. Plowing in the spring to prepare the soil, sowing the seed, weeding through the summer, harvesting in the autumn, the most intensive period of all, when every available person works the fields from first light to last to bring in the grain before the weather breaks. The ploughing is done with heavy wooden ploughs, often fitted with iron cutting blades, pulled by oxen or horses depending on what the household owns. The work is slow and physically demanding, requiring the farmer to manage the animal and the plough simultaneously, keeping the furrow straight, adjusting to the variations in the soil, maintaining the correct depth. An experienced ploughman can read the soil through the resistance in the plough, handles the way a skilled craftsperson reads their material through their tools, feeling the difference between clay and loam, between waterlogged ground and well-drained soil, between the soft earth of a recently ploughed headland and the hard-packed ground of a path. The pace of ploughing is the pace of the ox, slow and steady. The ox does not hurry. It does not understand hurrying. It walks at its own pace, which is a slow walk, and the farmer walks behind it at the same pace, and the plough moves through the soil at that same slow pace, and the furrow appears behind them, and the field slowly acquires the dark turned look of worked earth. Hour by hour, furrow by furrow, the work continues. The sky moves overhead. The light changes. The temperature shifts slightly as the day progresses. But the pace of the ploughing does not change. It is always the same pace. The pace of the ox. You can imagine the sound of it. The creak of the plough against the resistance of the soil. The low, steady sound of the ox's breathing and its hooves on the earth. The particular earthy smell of freshly turned soil, the sky wide and grey above the open field, the village small in the distance behind you. Weeding is different work. It is lower, closer to the ground, more varied in its small movements, but no less continuous and no less demanding of sustained attention. The weeds that grow in a medieval grain field are the same weeds that have always grown in cultivated ground. The same competitive plants that push up wherever soil is disturbed and sunlight is available. Removing them by hand, pulling them up from the root, or cutting them with a small bladed tool is work that requires you to move slowly along the rows of the growing crop, crouching or kneeling, your hands in the soil, doing the same motion repeatedly for hours. Your back aches after a while. Your knees ache. Your hands are stained with the juice of the plants and the dirt of the soil. None of this is remarkable. It is simply what the work is. The harvest, when it comes, is the most important work of the year, and in some ways, the most communal. Harvesting grain with a sickle is slow work, and a family's strips of field represent many days of harvesting for a single household. In practice, the whole village often work together through the harvest, each household helping the others in turn, the collective effort making it possible to bring everything in before the autumn rains could ruin it. This communal harvesting is one of the moments in the year when the social bonds of the village become most visible, when the usual routines of individual household labor give way to something more collective. The sickle is the harvest tool for grain. A curved blade on a short handle, used to cut the grain stalks at their base, gathering them in one arm while cutting with the other, laying the cut stalks in neat rows to be gathered and bound into sheaves. The motion is rhythmic and repetitive, the same bend and reach and cut and lay, over and over, row by row across the field. Like ploughing and weeding, it is work that occupies the hands and the body entirely without demanding much of the mind, and after enough hours of it, the mind tends to go quiet, settling into the rhythm of the work, the thoughts thinning and dispersing, the way mist disperses in morning sunlight. The women of the village are not idle during the long hours that the men spend in the fields. The domestic work of a medieval household is substantial and continuous, and it falls primarily to the women. Cooking, which is not a matter of opening packets and pressing buttons, but of grinding grain into flour and making bread from scratch, of tending the fire at exactly the right temperature for the pot, of preparing whatever raw ingredients are available into something edible, spinning and weaving, which are the source of every piece of cloth in the household, care of the children, who are many and young, and require constant attention until they are old enough to help with lighter tasks. The dairy work, if the household has cows, of making butter and cheese from the milk. The tending of the kitchen garden, where cabbages and onions and herbs and various other vegetables are grown close to the house for convenience. The spinning is perhaps the most constant of these tasks. Wool needs to be cleaned and combed and then spun into thread before it can be woven into cloth. A household uses an enormous amount of cloth for clothing and for bedding and for dozens of other purposes, and producing all of it from the raw wool of the household's sheep requires continuous spinning, day after day, month after month. The spindle and distaff, The tools of hand spinning are almost always present in depictions of medieval women because they were almost always present in medieval women's hands. Spinning was something done while doing other things, while watching the children, while tending the fire, while resting after a meal. The thread accumulated slowly, spool by spool, the weeks of work gradually becoming the cloth that became the family's clothing. Let us think now about the village as a social place, because even in a small and quiet community, social life has its texture and its rhythms. The medieval village was not a lonely place. The very smallness and closeness of it, the fact that everyone knew everyone and everyone's circumstances were well known to their neighbors, meant that there was a constant low-level social awareness that permeated daily life. You knew who was ill in the village. You knew whose harvest had been poor. You knew which family was in difficulty and which was doing well. This knowledge was not gossip, exactly, or not only gossip. It was the practical intelligence of a community that needed to function as a unit to survive. The well, as mentioned, was one of the gathering places of daily life. Fetching water was a task that brought people together at the same place at roughly the same times of day, and conversations happened there naturally, without being arranged. News from the wider world, filtered through the slow channels of medieval communication, arrived in the village occasionally in the form of a traveling merchant or a passing pilgrim or a neighbor who had been to the market town and returned with information. This news was discussed at the well and in the fields and in the evenings, turned over and examined and gradually absorbed into the shared understanding of the community. The church and the churchyard were the other great gathering places. Sunday Mass was an obligation, not just religious, but social, and the gathering of the whole village in the church each week was one of the few regular occasions when everyone was in the same place at the same time. Before and after the service, people talked, they caught up on each other's news, they arranged the small practical matters that required coordination. The churchyard, where the dead of the village lay buried, was also a place for informal gathering, a public space at the center of the village that was used for various purposes beyond its primary one. Feast days were important occasions in the medieval calendar, not just for the religious observance they marked, but for the social dimension they provided. The church calendar was dense with feast days, some of them occasions for genuine celebration, for shared food and perhaps music, and the simple pleasure of a day without heavy labor. These moments of collective enjoyment were not extravagant by any modern standard, but they were real, and they were valued, and they broke the monotony of the working year in ways that people looked forward to and remembered afterward. The social hierarchy of the village was real and present, but not always oppressive in its daily texture. The lord of the manor was a presence in the village's life, through the dues and obligations that the peasants owed to him, through the court that settled disputes, through the practical reality of his control over the land they farmed. But he was not necessarily physically present in the village on a daily basis, and the internal social life of the village had its own texture and its own leadership that operated largely independently of the formal hierarchy above it. Let us think now about the environment that enclosed and shaped this life. The natural world of medieval Europe was very different from the natural world that most modern people in the same regions experience today. There were more forests, large tracts of old woodland that had not yet been cleared for agriculture. There were more wetlands because the drainage projects that have altered the hydrology of so much of Europe had not yet been undertaken. There were more wild animals, wolves in the forests of France and Germany, bears in the mountains, wild boar almost everywhere. The sky was darker at night, clearer, full of stars in a way that is hard to experience in modern Europe, outside of the most remote areas. The seasons were more present, more determining, more impossible to ignore or escape. In winter, the cold was the central fact of life, the thing that everything else organized itself around. The shortness of the days, The difficulty of working the frozen ground, the constant management of the fire and the food supply, and the warmth of the animals, all of it oriented towards surviving the cold and emerging into spring with the household and its resources intact. Winter in a northern European village had a particular quality of waiting to it, a quality of hunkering down, of turning inward, of managing carefully the resources that had been accumulated through the summer and autumn, and that had to last until the spring brought new growth. The fields were bare and grey, the trees were bare, the sky was low and often grey, the days were short and the nights were long. The village pulled itself together into its houses and its fires and waited. You can imagine the particular quiet of a medieval village in deep winter. The snow on the ground if the winter is cold enough, which it often is. The bare fields stretching away in every direction, pale and still. The smoke from the chimneys rising straight up in the cold, still air. The sound of the village muffled by the cold and the snow. The paths between the houses narrow tracks in the white, worn down by the necessary daily journeys to the well and the animals. The spring, when it came, was the most eagerly anticipated change in the medieval year. The lengthening days, the first green appearing in the fields and on the hedges, the animals producing milk again after the winter, the kitchen gardens beginning to show new growth, the lifting of the heaviness of winter, the return of the possibility of warmth and abundance. Spring was also the time of greatest hunger, the hungry gap between the end of the winter stores and the first new food of the year. But even in the hunger, there was the promise of its end, which winter did not offer. Summer brought the long working days, the full intensity of the agricultural year, the warmth that made outdoor life genuinely possible and sometimes even pleasant. The smell of summer in a medieval landscape was the smell of growing things, of warm earth and green vegetation, of the flowers in the meadows and the hay being cut and dried. The sounds of summer were the sounds of work and of the natural world, birdsong and the wind through the grain and the sounds of animals in the fields. Autumn was the harvest and the preparation, the intensity of bringing in the crops, the careful work of storing and preserving what had been grown, the slaughter of animals that could not be fed through the winter, the laying up of wood and peat for the cold months ahead. Autumn had the quality of completion to it, of a year's work being gathered in, of the long, slow effort of the summer months crystallizing into the stores that would sustain the household through the winter. A good harvest brought a genuine, quiet satisfaction. A poor harvest brought a genuine, quiet anxiety about what the winter would demand. The relationship between medieval people and their natural environment was intimate in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of modern life. These were people who watched the sky constantly for information about what the weather would do, who knew the particular significance of certain cloud formations, certain wind directions, certain behaviors of animals, who understood the cycle of the agricultural year, not as an abstraction, but as the concrete, physical reality around which their entire existence was organized. The first frost, the first green of spring, the appearance of particular birds at particular times of year, the behavior of the river in flood season. All of these natural signs were read and interpreted and used in the practical management of daily life with a precision that reflected generations of accumulated observation. The sounds of the medieval village at different times of day and different seasons of the year are worth pausing to imagine. The sound of the village at midday in summer, when everyone is in the fields, and only the very young and the very old remain in the village, and the only sounds are birdsong and the distant voices from the fields and the slow sounds of the animals. The sound of the village in the evening when the workers are coming back from the fields, voices and footsteps and the sounds of animals being settled for the night, a temporary increase in activity that fades as the households draw inside. Let us move now toward the evening. The late afternoon in a medieval village has a particular quality. The light is changing, the shadows lengthening, the air cooling as the sun moves toward the horizon. The people in the fields are finishing what can be finished and leaving what must wait until tomorrow. The animals that have been grazing on the common land are being brought back to the farmyard for the night. The women who have been working at various tasks through the day are turning their attention to the evening meal. The evening meal is not much more elaborate than the morning meal. Pottage again, or bread with cheese, or some combination of these. In a household that has been fortunate in its hunting or fishing, there might be some meat or fish. On feast days, there might be something a little more celebratory, a little more varied. But on most evenings, the food is the same food that has been eaten for as long as anyone can remember, prepared in the same way, eaten in the same place. Bread, when there is grain to make it, is a significant and valued food. Medieval bread is not the soft white bread of modern experience. It is dense and dark, made from coarsely ground rye or barley flour, leavened with a sourdough starter that is kept going from one baking to the next, baked in the ashes of the fire or on a flat hearthstone. The result is heavy and slightly sour and very filling. A substantial piece of this bread and a bowl of pottage constitutes an adequate meal. Not an exciting meal, not a varied meal, but an adequate one. You can imagine eating this meal in the firelight. The room warm now after the cold of the day. The family gathered around the hearth. The sounds of eating and the occasional quiet exchange of words. The fire doing its patient work in the center of the room. The darkness outside the shuttered windows, complete and soft. After the evening meal, the household settles into the indoor activities of the evening. Spinning, if there is light enough, which there usually is by the fire. The repair of tools or clothing. The quiet conversation of people who have shared a working day and are now sharing the rest after it. In a household with children, the children are going to sleep, drawn toward the sleeping platform by the weight of a day of outdoor activity, their eyes heavy in the firelight, their bodies tired in the clean and simple way of children who have used all their energy on real physical things. The adults sit a while longer by the fire. The conversation grows quieter and more intermittent. There is nothing that particularly needs to be said, nothing that requires discussion that has not already been discussed. There is just the fire and the warmth and the comfortable tiredness of the body and the particular quietness of the late evening hour. The fire is the center of everything in these final hours of the day. Its light, its warmth, its sound. The orange light of it moves on the walls and ceiling, never still, always shifting slightly with the movement of the flames. The shadows in the corners of the room are deep and permanent. The smell of the wood smoke is thick and comfortable. The sound of the fire, the low crackle and pop and hiss of the burning wood, is a sound that has been present all day, that is as much a part of the interior of this house as the walls and the floor, and that in the evening takes on a particular quality of restfulness. Someone gets up and adds a final piece of wood to the fire and then covers the coals with ash to hold them through the night. This is a careful, practiced movement, the same movement every night, done without much thought because it has been done so many times. The fire dims under its ash, glowing dull orange rather than bright, giving off warmth but very little light now. The room darkens further. The sleeping places are along the walls, on platforms raised slightly above the earthen floor, covered with straw-stuffed mattresses and rough woolen blankets. The family lies down together in the same room, the same warmth, the same darkness. The children are already asleep, their breathing slow and even. The adults settle into their places, and the last quiet sounds of the household disappear one by one into the silence. Outside, the village is completely dark. There are no lights anywhere except the very faint glow that might escape from a shutter that does not quite close completely. The paths between the houses are invisible in the darkness. The fields beyond the village are visible only as a slightly lighter darkness against the dark sky, and only when there is enough moon to provide even that much. The animals in the yards are still. The wind, which has been present throughout the day, has perhaps dropped a little, or perhaps it is simply less noticeable now that there is no reason to be outside. The stars, on a clear night, are extraordinary. The whole sweep of the sky, unpolluted by any artificial light, filled from horizon to horizon with the cold fire of stars. The Milky Way, a pale band across the dark. The familiar patterns of the constellations clear and bright and close. These stars have been seen from this village every clear night for as long as anyone has lived here. They are a constant, a fixed thing in a world where very little is fixed. Their presence is not remarkable, but it is real, and it is there. And on the clearest nights, the people who step outside for a moment before sleep look up at them with the same unremarkable familiarity with which they look at everything else in the landscape of their daily lives. Inside the house, the darkness is complete. The banked fire gives almost no light. The room is warm enough, or close enough to warm enough. The collective body heat of the sleeping family and the residual warmth of the fire maintaining the temperature above what the cold outside would otherwise make of it. The breathing of the sleeping household is the only sound. This is where the medieval day ends. In darkness, in warmth, in the quiet company of the people who make up a life. Not in comfort by any modern standard, not in security in any deep sense, but in the ordinary, repeated, unremarkable conclusion of another day, lived in the same way as all the days before it, in the same place, by the same people, in the same rhythm that their parents had lived and their parents before them. You can let the image of it settle over you now. The dark room and the warm air and the sleeping family, the fire breathing quietly under its ash, the village dark and still outside, the fields empty and cold, the sky full of stars, all of that ordinary life lived by ordinary people, day after day, season after season, generation after generation, the ploughing and the weeding and the harvesting and the carrying of water and the tending of animals and the spinning of thread and the cooking of pottage and the banking of the fire at the end of the day, all of it so slow and repetitive and unremarkable and simply real. Let it all grow soft now. Let the medieval village grow quiet and distant, the fires dimming, the voices fading, the whole long day of work and eating and social life and weather and seasons all blurring at the edges, becoming less distinct, becoming simply a warm and quiet impression rather than a clear picture. You are warm. You are resting. There is nothing that needs your attention. The fire is banked. The shutters are closed. The household is sleeping. Let your own breathing slow down just a little more, just naturally, just following the rhythm of the room, the slow rhythm of people sleeping in the warmth after an ordinary day. Let your thoughts grow soft and formless, like smoke rising in a still room, like the light of the fire on a wall, like the sound of wind through thatch. There is nothing to hold on to now, nothing to keep track of. The medieval world is 1,000 years away and very quiet tonight. Just the dark and the warmth and the slow, soft, steady presence of sleep. Let it come. Just rest. Just breathe. Just sleep.